Hi guys, I hope I've got this right and we're recording, and I'm looking forward to a conversation with you now that focuses on the electrophysiology of the heart. Sorry about that. If you remember from our first lecture where we started to talk about the heart, we talked about the basic structure, the muscle and the blood flow through that heart when it gets its own nutrition in that diastole or resting phase, and when it's doing the contracting or the work of the heart that serves the rest of the body during systole. And in this, and so that was a review of the anatomy and physiology. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the electrophysiology of the heart. And once we get through this one, and then a little bit of an overview of the process of really reading an output that talks about the electrophysiology of the heart through a picture, that graphic depiction, we'll get right into actually doing it, and that's exciting. So let's start here. The conduction system of the heart is really important to understand. The heart is made up of specialized cells. We have an electrical system made up of what are called pacemaker cells. And these pacemaker cells are remarkable because they are the only cells in the body that are able to initiate their own electrical impulse. And so that's really critical. It's essential for how the heart functions, and it's able to initiate its own electrical activity. And it is the electrical activity, the consequence of that electrical activity, that leads to the motor activity of the heart. And so we always look at those two things, and those two systems can work in concert. Electrical activity leads, so that conduction leads to that muscle contraction. And we can have an interruption in the electrical activity. We can also have an interruption in the capacity of the heart to actually contract or pump well. And both of those things are important. What the cardiogram, a 12-lead ECG or a lead 2 or another lead strip shows us is about the electrical conduction through the heart. That doesn't tell us necessarily how well the heart is pumping. It tells us about the pattern of electrical conduction, and the likely consequence within the heart, and we can make inferences about how well the heart is pumping and the cardiac output based on that. We can look at patterns of potential injury, and we can look at our ability to intervene with that in effective ways, either pharmacologically or in other ways. So it's really important to, again, recognize those special electrical pacemaker cells found only within the heart and arranged in a really important system of pathways. So they're not just all over the place, that every cell in the heart has this pacemaker capacity, but they are arranged in these important pathways, and it's very systematic. So as we go through the next few slides, we'll really talk about how that pacemaker capacity starts at one point in the heart and moves its way down. And this is where we come back to that concept of redundancy. So in a normal heart, the cells of the conduction system are interconnected, and that conduction system ensures that the chambers of the heart contract in a coordinated fashion. If you remember from our previous lecture, the atria contract first and followed very quickly by contraction of the ventricles. And that's really important because that next, if you remember, we're always going to come back to that concept. The contraction of the atria gives you that atrial kick up to 30% of our cardiac output. So we want the atria to contract first to really empty what's left of the blood that's in that in the atria, to move that into the ventricles, which have already started to fill passively, and then the ventricles contract very quickly after that, and the ventricles then send that blood either to pulmonary circulation or to our generalized body circulation. Now, the normal heartbeat that we hear in patients who are well, otherwise well, is a result of that electrical impulse that starts at what's called the SA node. So that's the sinoatrial node, and that's right up, if you see on your picture, that sort of yellow dot, that's the SA node in the right atrium. And the intrinsic rate of the SA node is 60 to 100 beats per minute, and remarkably, isn't that the normal heartbeat of a human being, 60 to 100 beats. The SA node is normally the primary pacemaker of the heart, and it's normally what's called the primary pacemaker because it has the fastest normal or intrinsic rhythm. So what happens is the SA node is the first one to kick in. It's the fastest and it's the first one to kick in. And we'll talk about it later if the SA node doesn't kick in, or if the SA node rate drops below a certain level. There are other parts of that electric pathway that will begin to kick in. And that's when we see some either aberrancy, so we have other cells kicking in when they shouldn't, or we see other parts of the pathway actually saving us. So they're kicking in because they are rescuing the heart when that primary node, that SA node, is not firing at that appropriate rate and is not doing the job that it needs to do. Okay, so let's carry on with this conduction system. As the impulse leaves that SA node, it spreads from cell to cell, and it spreads in like a wave-like pattern. And you can imagine that sort of telephone line idea that it moves down along the wave, and that moves across that atrial muscle. And as the impulse spread, it stimulates that right atrium, the interatrial septum, so the septum between the two atria, and then the left atrium. So the right atrium actually contracts just a tiny bit ahead of the left atrium. That doesn't really matter so much for you to know that, but it's worth just paying attention to. I'm not going to ever ask you about that, but just so you understand, there's that slight differentiation because the node, the SA node, is located in the right atria. So the impulse moves down from the SA node, across the right atria, across the septum between the atrium, the right and the left atrium, and then it moves down into the left atrium from there. So the result is that sort of almost simultaneous contraction of the right and the left atria, with the right just being like milliseconds ahead of the left. And because there's this fibrous skeleton that separates the atrial myocardium and the ventricular myocardium, remember the myocardium is the muscle, this electrical stimulus affects only the atrium. So you can imagine if there was no separation, no kind of tissue that separated the atria from the ventricles, this electrical stimulation would affect the whole heart. But remember, we want the atria to contract, give you that atrial kick, and then the ventricles to contract right after that. So we need that sort of sequential process, and there's that kind of tissue that separates the atria and the ventricles that prevents the conduction from moving through very quickly. Okay, now we go to internodal pathways. So conduction through the AV node happens before atrial depolarization is completed. What does that mean? Well, remember, we started our SA node. We move through these internodal pathways, which are those pathways between the SA node and the next node, which is called our atrioventricular node, the node between the atria and the ventricles. And those pathways, again, run across the atria and innervate the septum. And then the impulse moves to the AV node. And those pathways that move across the atria, they've been labeled as anterior, middle, and posterior internodal pathways. And they consist of a mixture of ordinary myocardial cells and then those specialized conducting fibers. Okay, so those are just you'll notice that there's several pathways. It's not just one singular pathway from that SA node, that's the yellow dot, to that green dot, which is your AV node, your atrioventricular node. But there are several different pathways that carry that electrical, that allow for electrical conduction between those nodes. And it's really important that SA node, if you think of the nodes, they're sort of a gathering up place. The SA node is the primary pacemaker, it's the primary starting point. The AV node is the next gathering up point. So the electrical conduction moves from that SA node through these three internodal pathways down to the AV node. And it's really important that we sort of gather it up all together, gather up all that energy. If the energy just came in little bits and spurts and then moved down, it would all be diffused. Instead, the function of that AV node is to gather it up. So it comes from those three pathways to that AV node. And what's important to understand about the AV node? Again, located at the bottom of the right atrium, and it's supplied for most people by the right coronary artery. That's important to understand because when we have damage to our heart that affects those coronary arteries, in particular damage that may affect that right coronary artery, or when we have a blockage in that right coronary artery, we may see some aberrant conduction because that's the artery that supplies oxygen and other nutrients to the cardiac cells in that area. That AV node, it causes a little bit of a delay in the conduction of that impulse. So remember, we started at the SA node. We've moved through those three internodal pathways, and now there's just a gathering up of steam, a building up of steam before that conduction is going to move into that very important ventricle. That allows for that atrial kick to happen. So remember, we have to, the atria has to contract before and fully fill that ventricle, fully empty itself so that we've got that 30% extra cardiac output. And so that gathering up of steam right there at that AV node allows for that little bit of delay in time. It also makes sure that there's that full electrical charge that's going to then move through the ventricle. Okay, so here we see the next part of our pathway. So as the impulse enters the AV node, goes through those internodal pathways, enters the AV node, conduction is slowed down and the impulse reaches the ventricle. And that delay occurs in part because the fibers of the AV node are smaller than the fibers of the atrial muscle. And so there's fewer what we call gap junctions, fewer opportunity for that electrical impulse to move through. And so remember, again, I'm going to just make this point, if that delay didn't occur, the atria and the ventricles would contract together, and that would, we wouldn't have that atrial kick. We wouldn't have the opportunity for the atria to fully fill the ventricle with all of its blood before the ventricle then contracts and sends that blood either to the pulmonary system or generalized conduction, or generalized body circulation. Okay, now as we move through the conduction system, we've started at the AV node. We've gone through those internodal pathways. We've gathered up steam, a little bit of a delay, and gathered up steam at started at the SA node, moved through the internodal pathway, gathered up steam at the AV node, and now we need to move through the ventricles because we need to make sure that those ventricles contract. And this is where the conduction moves through the ventricles. So after passing through the AV node, the electrical impulse enters what's called the bundle of His. And I'll show you on the next slide a picture. And that bundle of His is located along the upper portion of the septum. So that's the area that divides, the tissue that divides the two ventricles. And so it makes perfect sense because it's going to cause conduction through both ventricles. Now the bundle of His has pacemaker cells too. Remember, we've got these pacemaker cells located along this entire conduction system. And if you remember, the pacemaker cells of the SA node were 60 to 100, at normal heart rate. The pacemaker cells through the bundle of His are around 40 to 60. Now, do you see why that would be important? What we don't want is the cells competing with each other. As we move down the entire conduction system, their natural or intrinsic rate is lower and lower because if you think about it, they become the rescue cell. They become the cells that kick in when the cells at the higher levels of the heart are not working. So as the heart slows down, let's say there's a issue with conduction through the atria, the heart gets to a rate lower than 60, then cells lower down will kick in as part of a rescue. This way we don't have cells from different parts of the heart competing with each other because that would interfere with the ability of the heart to contract in that rhythmic, regular fashion. And so the bundle of His then conducts an electrical impulse to the right and the left bundle branches. And I bet you've heard that word sometimes when we talk about cardiac blockages. We can see that there's a patient may have a blockage in conduction through those bundle branches. And those bundle branches are just further down along the conduction system and they separate out. They look like a network of branches on a tree. They spread out so that you have conduction across through that ventricle. So the bundle of His receives its blood supply from branches of the left anterior and the posterior descending coronary artery. You don't have to memorize that. The only point in understanding that is to know that when we see an MI potentially where there is damage to that part of the heart, we need to be concerned about conduction through that area. Additionally, if we have a blockage, if we have a patient who comes in for an angiogram and we see a blockage in those arteries, we know that that may cause conduction issues in that part of the heart. So because of this dual blood supply, though, it's really interesting. Again, we talk about that redundancy of the body. The bundle of His is less vulnerable to ischemic changes because if blood through one pathway, through one coronary artery is blocked, there is that dual mechanism where blood is able to reach that area through the other coronary artery. And so the term His-Purkinje system or His-Purkinje network refers to the bundle of His. So down that center, down the septum, the bundle of His, and I'll show it to you on the next slide, those bundle branches, And then at the very end, we have what's called Purkinje fibers that really sort of spread out. So let me show that to you. All right. So do you see, we start at our SA node again, that yellow dot. The conduction moves through those internodal pathways up in the atria, and it all gathers up steam at that yellow, or at the green AV node. Then then the energy is conducted further down through the bundle of His. Do you see that between at the septum, between the two ventricles, and we see that it start to branch off. And then we see the various names for the different bundle branches along the left and the right side, or posterior or anterior. And it moves down as we follow those bundle branches. It moves down to the end where you see those Purkinje fibers, where it actually looks much more fibrous than spread. So again, I'm not going to really belabor this, but to understand that those, as we move through that system, we go from the bundle of His down through those bundle branches, the anterior left bundle branch, the posterior left bundle branch, and the right bundle branch there. And then we move right down into those Purkinje fibers. Also, it's important to recognize that right at the top, right below the AV node, we have that what we call the bundle of His. So bundle of His breaks out into those bundle branches, those various bundle branches, and then down into those Purkinje fibers. Now, when we look at those Purkinje fibers, they're right at the very end. Do you remember that principle we talked about of redundancy? SA node has an intrinsic rate of 60 to 100, that normal heart rate. The AV node and moving into the bundle of His, we're looking at a rate of 40 to 60. Remember, it's your rescue philosophy, the rescue principle, that it doesn't want to be competing, because then various parts of the heart are going to be contracting at the same time, and it's going to be chaos. The heart will not function. It's a very orderly, organized conduction of electrical impulse and then contraction. So SA node, 60 to 100. AV node and into the bundle of His, we're looking at 40 to 60. As we move down even further in our rescue process, when we get right down to those Purkinje fibers, which are really right at the end of that conduction mechanism, their intrinsic rate is 20 to 40. It's not life-sustaining. It is such a rescue rate, but that tells you that is right down at the very end of the conduction pathway. Okay, so again, we're going to look at this, and you can look at this again, but we've got our SA node through those fibers into our internodal pathways, into our AV node, down through, or we see our bundle of His, our bundle branches, and into our Purkinje fibers. Now let's see, over on the right-hand side, we have the beginnings of a tracing. And what we see here is our P wave, that QRS, and the T wave. And it'll be really important that we understand all of the meanings of those complexes we're going to go through. So the P wave, do you see where that we have that's upward deflection in our P wave? That's where we have excitation happening in our atria. So that atrial excitation is seen in the P wave. In the Q, so that Q is your first downward deflection. It's not, you don't always see it. And we'll talk about the characteristics of it in a few minutes, but you've got our Q, then our R, which is our first upward deflection, and our S, and as well as our T wave. That represents that excitation of the ventricles, and that begins with that downward deflection of the Q wave, QRS, and then T is our repolarization. Okay, so what does an ECG tell us? ECG is really important because it tells us some really important information about the heart and the chest. It tells us about some conduction disturbances. It tells us about electrical effects of medications and electrolytes when we look at various the amplitude or the height of various waves. It tells us about how big the cardiac muscle may be when we have like hypertrophy. We talked about that in class last week. There was a question about that. and it can tell us really importantly about ischemic damage. What it does not tell us is about the mechanical or the contractile condition of the heart. So remember, it tells us about the electrophysiology of the heart. It tells us about how that heart, that conduction system is working. But it's important to recognize that the conduction system may be working perfectly and the heart is not contracting appropriately in response, because we might have something like hypertrophy. That left hypertrophy is really common. That muscle may be damaged in some way. So the electrical system, this is a view into the electrical system. We can make inferences about the heart's contractility or the cardiac output, but they're only inferences. So they're only suggestions, and that's really important to keep in mind. Okay, so let's start looking at what a tracing may look like. And we're going to start with the very basics of an ECG, the ECG tracing paper. So look at the paper. We've got little squares, bigger squares, and blocks. The smallest square is 1 millimeter wide, so it's pretty tiny, and 1 millimeter high. You see it over on the right-hand side highlighted. It's 1 millimeter wide and 1 millimeter high. 5 squares are outlined by slightly heavier lines. And within each of those blocks that are circled by those heavier lines, we have 25 small squares. So 5 across and 5 high. And it's really important. What we're looking at here is that the ECG paper and the tracing that runs on it measures amplitude and duration of waveforms. And we use a standard recording. So you will always see paper that is exactly the same. If I was in India, if I was in England, if I was in Antarctica, you always see this exact tracing paper. So remember, ECG is just a graphical representation of that heart's electrical activity. When you put electrodes on someone's body and connect them to an ECG, the machine records the voltage. And remember, the voltage is that sort of difference in action potential between the electrodes. So the needle on that ECG machine or the pen moves a specific distance depending on the voltage. So it's like a volt. It moves a specific distance up or down depending on that voltage. And that recording is made again on this special paper. That ECG paper, if you think about it, it looks like graph paper with those small and big boxes. Smallest boxes, 1 millimeter wide and 1 millimeter high. The horizontal axis of the paper, so along the bottom, represents time. So this all tells us it's important that we recognize what's happening around conduction over time, because heart rate is really important to us, right? There's a life-sustaining component. Cardiac output depends on pumping blood around within a certain rate. And time is used to measure the interval between or the duration of specific cardiac events. So we look at both how often you are getting electrical impulses moving through various areas, but also how long it takes, how long that conduction takes. And we talk about that within seconds. So do you remember we talked about that little box? The smallest square is 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter. The one went along the horizontal axis or time, that 1 millimeter equals 0.04 seconds. Okay, and I'm going to show you that again on the next page. So that horizontal axis is time. The width of each box is 0.04 seconds. The width of those 5 boxes that are outlined in that, with those darker lines, is 0.20 seconds. Okay, 0.20 seconds for each of those boxes. And we're still talking about time. So when we look along those boxes, if we have 5 large boxes, 5 of those boxes outlined with the darker line, that's 1 second. 15 large boxes is 3 seconds, and 30 large boxes is 6 seconds. That's important because when we're talking about different mechanisms for, or different processes for looking at analyzing an ECG strip, one of them involves the use of time in the 6-second strip. So 5 large boxes, 1 second, 15 large boxes, 3 seconds, 30 large boxes, and literally you count that out, 30 large boxes, and there's some markings on the paper that help you, that is 6 seconds. The vertical axis is voltage or its amplitude. And we measure that in millivolts or in millimeters. And Where that will become important is when we're looking at how deep a wave may be in particular. And there's some pathology associated. In particular, we're looking at around that with Q waves. We're looking at what's called the isometric line, so that coming back to that main line along which your impulse is conducted. And that helps you to understand when you have elevations or depressions, so above or below that. So it's really important to look at the sensitivity that the machine is calibrated to appropriately, and clinically the height of the waveform is usually stated in millimeters rather than millivolts. So we don't typically talk about millivolts, although it is measured in millivolts. We talk about it in millimeters, and we'll talk about when that's relevant to consider. So along the bottom is duration, so that's time, right? How quickly something is happening. Along the vertical axis, we're looking at amplitude or size. So how high something is, how low something is, like the actual, we measure the size of it, and also look at it in relation to that isoelectric line. Okay. I think again, I'm just going to move along. ECG paper. There we go. So waveforms. What do we need to know about this? We've got 2, 4, 5 things that we will need to really focus on. The first is that what we call our baseline, or that isoelectric line. That is a straight line recorded when electrical activity is not detected. If I just turned the machine on and had it running with no electrical activity, let's say I had it on a person who has no electrical activity at all, they're dead, or I had it just attached to something that was inanimate, I would see this isoelectric line, and that would be running straight across horizontally. That's the isoelectric line. We don't have any movement up or down away from it. A waveform, on the other hand, is that movement up or down away from that isoelectric line. When it's above that line, we call it positive. And when it's below that line, we say that it's moved in a negative direction. Doesn't mean it's good or bad. It's just positive is above that line and negative is below that line. It's important to look at what a segment is. A segment is a line that flows between two waveforms. Do you remember when I showed you that P, QRS, and T? The P was our first upward deflection. We return to that isoelectric line, and then we move to our QRS complex, back to that isoelectric line, and then our T wave. The segment would be a line between various waveforms, and it's named for the waveform that precedes it. Okay, so the waveform that precedes that segment is how we call that segment. The interval is a waveform and a segment. So for example, we have our P wave. Imagine our first upward deflection is that P wave, and if you remember, we said that that P wave represents that depolarization of the atrium. So we've got our P wave. Then we can have our segment, which would be that segment that follows the P, which is the P segment, which is that back to the isoelectric line between the P and then the beginning of our new waveform, which is the QRS. We also have our interval. So the PR interval goes from P, beginning of P, encompasses the P wave, and also that segment that follows the P wave, which is back on the isoelectric line, till we get to our QRS complex. We call it typically a PR interval because the Q is not always there, so it's not necessary. So we would go from the beginning of the P to the beginning of the next complex, to the next complex, or the next waveform. Sorry, the beginning of the P to the beginning of our next waveform, whether it starts with Q or it goes right up into a positive form. And then finally, we talk about a complex, which is several waveforms. So our P, QRS, T, that's our complex. That is the conduction through the entire cardiac system through one cycle, and that is called a complex. So it's multiple waveforms. Several waveforms, so that's up and down motion. So, so we can have our P wave, our PR interval, which is the P wave, and our R segment on the isoelectric line. We can have a complex that has multiple deflections up and down, so our QRS complex. has our Q, which may or may not be there, which is the first downward deflection, our R, which is our first upward deflection, and back returning to that isoelectric line with our S, back downward deflection. Okay, so here we go. Yikes, look at all of this. So again, let's look, we've got a P, a QRS, and a T. And let's talk about each one of those things and what they represent. So our P wave represents activation of the SA node at the beginning of that P wave. And typically we don't really see that on the ECG, but what we see is the spreading of that wave across the atria throughout the atrial depolarization. And the first waveform in the cardiac cycle typically is what we're going to see as the P wave, that first upward deflection, and that represents the depolarization of the atria. The beginning of the P wave is recognized as the first abrupt or even a gradual movement away from the baseline. And its end is at the point at which the waveform returns to the baseline. You see the P begins as it starts to go up, and it ends as we return to that baseline. The first half of the P wave is recorded when the electrical impulse that originated in the SA node stimulates the right atrium and reaches the AV node. The downslope part of the P wave reflects stimulation of the left atrium. And so that P wave really represents atrial depolarization and the spread of that impulse across both the right atria, which is the first upward slope, and then the left atria, which is a downward slope. And a P wave normally precedes each QRS complex. We always want to see a P wave preceding each QRS complex. The atria contract, remember, a fraction of a second after the P wave begins, and the atria begin to repolarize at the same time as the ventricles depolarize. So a waveform reflecting atrial repolarization is usually not seen in an ECG because it's buried in the QRS. We always say that. So we see the atria depolarize in that P wave. Later, when we get to the T wave, we'll see repolarization of the ventricles, but we don't see repolarization of the atria. And that's only because it's not that it's not happening. Of course, it has to happen or we're not going to have another impulse, but it doesn't happen. We don't see it because it's buried in the QRS. Too much else is happening for us to see that. So let's talk about that P wave. Normal P wave characteristics. It's smooth and round. We don't want a sharp, pointy, triangle-looking thing. It's no more than 2.5 millimeters in height. A peaked P wave will tell you some things. It's no more than 0.11 seconds in duration. Now, do you remember how much that would be if we looked at those boxes? Those little boxes, remember they were 0.04 seconds? So 0.4, 0.8, 3 full boxes would be 0.12. So it's just less than that. It cannot be more than 0.11 seconds in duration within that normal range. And it's positive in several leads. Lead 1, lead 2, AVF, V2, and V6. And most of what we talk about for these classes is going to be lead 2, the most common universal lead in which we look at basic interpretation. Okay, let's look at that QRS. Oh, I love the QRS. The QRS tells you a lot. Remember, the QRS is what's happening in the ventricles. So it's the QRS is important to keep in mind that it consists of several waveforms. It consists of the Q wave, which is that first downward deflection. We're looking at that purple tracing there, first downward deflection. The R wave, which is your first upward deflection, and the S wave. And the S wave, again, is your downward deflection, and it can come back to the isoelectric line or it can go below it. And that represents the spread of the electrical impulse across those ventricles, or that ventricular depolarization. And it's the sum of all ventricular muscle cell depolarization. So remember that ventricle through that bundle of His, and then down all the way to those Purkinje fibers. Okay. In a normal ECG waveform, and here we see P, Q, R, S, T, waveforms, intervals, and correlation with events of the cardiac cycle is really important to keep in mind. The P wave, we talked about this already, represents atrial depolarization. That's followed immediately by atrial systole, that gap there, right? Atrial systole. So that's that contraction. Remember systole. The QRS represents ventricular depolarization. And that's followed immediately by ventricular systole. You see we're back at the isoelectric line after our QRS, and that's ventricular systole, that's the ventricles contracting. The ST segment corresponds to phase 2, remember from S to T, phase 2 of the action potential. During that time, the heart muscle is completely depolarized, and that's where we're having contraction, okay? So in that ST contraction of the ventricles. The T wave represents that ventricular repolarization. And you remember, we don't see atrial repolarization because that's buried as the QRS is happening. So much is happening with the ventricle depolarization that atrial repolarization doesn't show up. The PR interval, remember intervals, it's the from the beginning of a waveform to the beginning of the next waveform. That's what includes the segment back at the isoelectric line following that. So PR is beginning of P to that next R, and if there's a Q, that's where we start. There's not always a Q, that's why we call it PR. That corresponds to atrial depolarization and that delay we talked about at the AV node. The QT interval, now do you see that? That's the beginning of the Q all the way to the end of the T, QT interval, represents the time from the initial depolarization of the ventricles to the end of ventricle repolarization. QT is really important because if that QT is lengthened, that can cause conduction delays that are problematic. And in particular, we know that some medications can lead to lengthening of the QT interval, or QT, the QT interval. And it's really important that when we recognize that there may be some very common medications, things like Benadryl, that are contraindicated. So looking at QT, which is a calculation, is and often based on rate and other things, is really important. Ventricular depolarization normally triggers contraction of the ventricular tissues. And that shortly after that QRS complex begins, we see that ventricular contraction. And you see that QRS, it's significantly larger than the P wave. And that's because depolarization of the ventricles involves a considerably greater muscle mass. Remember, those ventricles are so big compared to the atrium. Atrial repolarization takes place during that ventricular depolarization, but again, the ventricles have taken over charge of the house, and we don't see that repolarization happen. Okay, let's look at that Q wave. Interesting. So a QRS complex normally follows each P wave, right? We've got that P wave, and then we see these QRS complexes. One or even two of the three waveforms that make up the QRS complex may not always be present. So the QRS complex begins typically as a downward deflection with the Q wave. And a Q wave, so your first downward deflection, we call it a Q. It's always negative. The Q wave begins when that ECG leaves the isoelectric line and goes downward and continues until it returns to the isoelectric line. So it doesn't. So when we look at the little strips on the side, we've got a variety of Q waves where you see the Q wave starts at that downward deflection and ends when you return to the isoelectric line. And then it moves right up into that upward deflection, which is your R wave. And the Q wave represents depolarization of the interventricular septum. Remember we talked about that bundle of His goes through that, innervates that septum between the two ventricles. So the Q wave represents depolarization of that septum, which is activated again, sort of like the atria, but this one is activated from the left side to the right side. And in lead 2, the direction of that current flow is almost perpendicular. And so that's why we see that deflection. It's important to differentiate a normal or physiological Q wave from a pathological Q wave. And with the exception of a couple leads that we're not really going to get into at this point, what we want to watch that the Q wave is not more than 0.04 seconds. So again, how much would we see in terms of measuring our boxes? In time, 0.04 seconds would be one little box. So it should not be wider than one little box. And it should not be deeper than 1/3 the height of the following R wave. So let's look at those examples to the right. In the first two, which are physiologic Q waves, they're fine. We see that it is not wider than one little box. You see the width on the first one and the second one, it's not wider than one little box, that downward deflection, the Q wave. And as we move up into the R wave, it's not deeper than 1/3 the height if we counted up all those little boxes. It's not deeper than 1/3. If you look at the second two examples, we see in both of them, it is wider than one little box, so it is far too wide. So that duration of that Q wave is too long. And in the last example you see on that tracing, it is also deeper than 1/3 the height of that subsequent R wave. So if we look at that subsequent R wave, it is about 9 boxes high. So and if we look at that Q wave, it is 1, 2, 3, 4, about 4.5 boxes deep. So that's about half the height of that subsequent R wave. So that final one it shows pathology in 2 ways. It is taking too long. So the duration is too long, and the depth, the height of it, is too great in comparison to that subsequent R wave. Okay, so what do we need to know about R and S wave? So your R wave is the first positive or upward deflection following the P wave. R waves are always positive. That first downward sloping is a Q wave. May or may not be there. We talked about the characteristics. It can't be too wide. It can't be too deep. The R wave is your first positive deflection. And your S wave is a negative waveform following the R wave. And an S wave is always negative. R and S waves represent depolarization of the right and left ventricles. Okay, do you remember that the Q wave was that depolarization of the interventricular septum? Now we've got depolarization of the right and left ventricles through our R and S waves. Okay, back to our QRS complex here again. I know, it's so exciting, isn't it? Don't worry that this is a lot of information, because we're going to go over it face to face, and we'll go over it through multiple different examples. So what do we need to know about this? Because of its great muscle mass, the QRS complex generally represents the electrical activity occurring in the left ventricle. Important to keep that in mind. So the left ventricle, because it's that big, huge powerhouse that has to be that cause a contraction that will send that blood out to generalized body circulation, that electrical activity is very large, and that the QRS complex may appear predominantly positive, negative, or biphasic. Biphasic means it's going up and down, and that all depends on the lead. Most of the time we're going to be talking about lead 2, but just to keep in mind that depending on the lead we were looking at, we could see predominantly positive, predominantly negative, or this biphasic representation of a QRS. So if we're looking at a 12 lead or a 15 lead ECG, we really need to understand which lead we're in, because that tells us about the angle at which the energy is traveling in relation to the electrodes, and that tells us what we should be expecting. Okay, normal QRS complex. The QRS duration, so remember duration is time. It's a measurement of the time required for ventricular depolarization. Remember, the P wave is atrial depolarization, that QRS complex is ventricular depolarization, and the width of a QRS complex is most accurately determined when it's viewed and measured in more than one. And we don't always do that, particularly if we're only doing lead 2 measurement, but it's important that that measurement is important to recognize. What we want to see when we're doing a measurement is that we take that measurement from the QRS complex with the longest duration and with the clearest onset and end. Sometimes in a tracing, you'll see some measurements that are clearer than others, and we want the clearest one with a good onset, clearest onset and ending. The beginning of the QRS complex is measured from the point where the first wave of the complex begins to deviate from the baseline. Remember, you've got your P wave, your PR interval, which includes that R segment, or P segment, sorry, and then when you go to your QRS, you're going to start your measurement from when it deviates from that segment, where we've been back at that isoelectric line. The point at which the last wave of the complex begins to level out or distinctly change directions at, above, or below the baseline marks the end of the QRS complex. The reason that's a little hard to describe is we don't always come exactly to the isoelectric line after our QRS. Sometimes the segment, which is again that line between the end of the QRS and the T. So our ST segment can be elevated or show a depression, so below the line. So what we want to see in the measuring of that, in figuring out where that QRS complex ends, sometimes it's where we see it level out, but not necessarily return to that isoelectric. Okay, so let's see, where are we going to go with this? T-wave. Our T-wave tells us a lot. And do you remember what the T-wave is all about? Ventricular repolarization. That's what's represented by the T-wave. It's the refractory period still present during the beginning of the T-wave, and at the peak of the T-wave, that relative refractory period has begun. It's during that period, that relative refractory period in the middle of the T-wave, that a stronger than normal sinus stimulus can produce ventricular dysrhythmia. So it's really important to recognize that in the middle, right at the peak of that T-wave, stronger than normal stimulus from somewhere else in the heart can lead to ventricular dysrhythmia, and that's why we really pay attention to that. So the beginning of the T-wave is identified as the point where the slope of that ST segment appears to become either abruptly or gradually steeper. So that ST segment, which may be at the isoelectric line in a normal tracing, or maybe above or below, and again, it may be that it's somewhat slopey as opposed to straight across, depending on a whole lot of things that are going on. But where we see it start to either abruptly go up or change in slope enough to be able to recognize a change, that's where we see the beginning of the T-wave. The direction of the T-wave is normally the same as the direction of the QRS complex that precedes us. And that's because depolarization begins on the endocardial surface, and it spreads across the epicardium. So in terms of normal T-waves, they often are slightly asymmetric. That's okay, not to worry about that. So not like a P-wave, which we see is nice and rounded. They can be negative in some leads, but normally upright in lead 2, which is the lead that we're going to be focusing on extensively. They're usually 0.5 millimeters or more in height in lead 2, again, which is what we're going to focus on. And they're usually 5 millimeters or less in height in any limb lead, or 10 millimeters or less in any chest. So just keeping that in mind. And just a lot to focus on with all of these measurements. We're going to repeat them as we go through this in terms of our class and measuring what we're looking for. All right, now our intervals. Yikes. Keeping in mind, this is just the beginning overview. So an interval, remember, is made up of the waveform plus the segment. And our PR interval consists of the P wave plus that segment, where we come back to the isoelectric line, that P segment. So PR starts at the beginning of P, goes all the way to the start of either your first downward Q, or if you go straight up to your R. We call it PR, but we're measuring it from the beginning of P to our back down to our isoelectric line and along our isoelectric line until we have our first deflection, whether it's upward or downward. And normally the length of time that we want to see that take is between 0.12 and 0.20 seconds. And remember our boxes. Each little box is 0.04. So it should take between 3 and 5 of those little boxes to go from the very first upward deflection of our P wave through that entire P wave and that and the PR segment there. All right. Let's see what we have next. An abnormal PR interval. So a long PR interval that's greater than 0.20 seconds, greater than 5 boxes, represents that the impulse was delayed as it passed through the atria, through the AV node, or even through that AV bundle. So remember that P wave and that segment represents the conduction, the depolarization through the SA node, through the atria, those internodal pathways down to the AV node, and even the AV bundle, which is before that bundle of hits. A short PR interval, which is less than 0.12 seconds, less than 3 boxes, that tells us that the impulse is getting through that pathway more quickly than we would expect. Sorry, I'm going to cough. Sorry. And when that conduction happens very quickly, what we wonder about is if the beginning of that conduction is not right up at the top of our conduction pathway, that the time is so quick that maybe the impulse is being generated lower in the atria, lower along the pathway in the atria, closer to the AV node or even to that AV bundle. So it's really important when we're looking at time, we're wondering if the impulse, which should take a certain amount of time to move from that SA node all the way through that process, internodal pathway down to the AV node and that AV bundle that follows right there. If that conduction is happening very, very quickly, we wonder if it actually initiated lower in the pathway. That tells us a little bit about aberrancy, which is a concern, because when our SA node is not the pacemaker of the system, the question for us is there some kind of excitability in the cells that another part of the pathway is taking over? The risk for us in that is that when some other part of the pathway takes over, there may be competition among cells, and we start to get a little bit of that chaotic process. Okay, the QT interval. Remember, the QT interval is that portion of the tracing that starts at the beginning of the QRS complex and goes right to the end of the T wave, and that represents total ventricular activity. And so it represents the time from ventricular depolarization to ventricular repolarization. When we want to measure that, we want to look in the lead that has the most clearly defined T wave, and typically when we're measuring, we're looking at lead 2, but you may switch leads so that you can see that most effectively. And again, we use the term QT interval regardless of whether the QRS complex has a Q or not. So if we start with a QRS complex that has that first Q with a downward deflection and goes all the way to the end of the T, we call it a QT interval. If in our complex, remember we said it can be completely normal not to have a Q. If we go back, we have our P wave, isoelectric line, and then we have our first upward deflection. Remember, upward is always called an R. The first upward deflection is an R. Even though we don't have a Q and we're measuring from the start of that first upward deflection, we don't call that an RT interval. We still call that a QT interval. And because of the variability of the QE interval with the heart rate, it can be measured most accurately if it's adjusted for that heart rate. And that's why QT interval, remember I told you, if it's a lengthened QT interval, there may be some concern about medications we give in other things. And so that's often a calculation that has to be made when you run a 12-lead ECG, it may identify a long QT interval. And so that sort of it's a corrected calculation that it's an important consideration to pay attention to. In particular, as nurses, the consideration for us is there a concern about electrolytes? Is there a concern about medications that we miss? So the QT interval is considered short if it's less than 0.39 seconds, and it's considered long or prolonged if it's more than 0.46 seconds. Remember, you're going to look at those boxes. A prolonged QT interval indicates a lengthened refractory period. A refractory period is a period where nothing can happen, where you're getting ready for that repolarization to happen, and that repolarization happens. And you can end up with very aberrant, dangerous heart rhythms, and in particular something that's called torsade de pointe, which is sort of a conduction, an aberrant conduction that happens in which you have a circulating, circular type conduction around an area and get looped in to a conduction that is life-threatening. Having a prolonged QT can be congenital, so people can be born with a predisposition to this. It can also be acquired, and things like myocardial ischemia, electrolyte disorders, a sudden drop in heart rate can lead you to something like this. Some kinds of neurological events, and again, some medications can prolong that QT. And in terms of shorter QT, we often don't see a shorter QT, but where we might see it is with digoxin, and we might see it when we have a hypercalcemia. So again, we're looking at those fluid and electrolytes, so important. Okay, R to R interval. R to R interval is what we use when we're measuring our ventricular rate and our ventricular regularity. So R to R is the R wave to the R wave. You see that the first R wave in that purple complex, and then the next R wave in the red complex to the right. And so that's the interval is used to determine the rate and rhythmicity or the regularity of your cardiac rhythm. And to evaluate the rhythmicity of the ventricular rhythm on a rhythm strip, the interval between two consecutive R to R waves is measured. So the distance between succeeding R to R intervals is measured and compared. So, and if the ventricular rhythm is regular, the R to R intervals that we measure will be the same. So if we were to move along and we were to measure the distance between the first R wave and the second R wave, and then we were to measure the distance between the second R wave and a third R wave, and the distance between the third and the fourth, if we have a regular heart rhythm, that distance, the R to R to R to R, is all the same. If we have an irregular heart rate, then we have impulses that are being conducted either early or late, and we have that variability in that R to R distance. Okay, P to P. P to P is used to determine the atrial rate and the atrial regularity. And again, that same thing, the interval between the two consecutive P waves is measured and compared to the succeeding P waves. So P to P to P to P. If it's equivalent, then we have a regular rate. If it's not equivalent, we don't. And remarkably, that is the end of our electrophysiology lecture. Now, I know it was a lot. We're going to go through it, and part of this will be application. We'll go through all of these concepts as we get our hands right into this and begin some ECG interpretation this week. I'm going to record one more short lecture, and in that I'm going to talk about sort of that basic process of ECG interpretation that lead to strip interpretation, and we'll really focus on what we measure and how we measure. In terms of what we just covered, you remember we talked about the conduction pathway. We talked about what each component of that strip tells us, what the P wave tells us, which is, do you remember? Yeah, atrial depolarization. The QRS, which tells us about ventricular depolarization, and the T wave, which tells us about ventricular repolarization. And remember, the atrial repolarization we don't see on that strip because it's buried in that QRS complex. So much is going on in those big ventricles that smaller electrical activity from the atria is buried. We don't see it. And that we look at the distance, so the duration of something, and that's time along the horizontal axis. And along the vertical axis, we look at what's called amplitude, so how big something is. And we're looking at the various waveforms, the shape of the waveforms, the deflections of the waveforms, and as they either come back to that isoelectric line or don't, and the time in which it takes for all of that to happen. So on to our next lecture, and I look forward to talking about this more face-to-face in class.